Advanced Seminar in U.S. Foreign Policy, America in a Multipolar World, Week 2. Moving into a New World Order. The administration of George H.W. Bush was short-lived. It was only 4 years long. His foreign policy is largely criticized for essentially a lack of focus. He coined the phrase New World Order, but never really defined what it was. He was preoccupied with dealing with the crumbling Soviet Empire, and he is criticized for having no real global vision. Domestic politics largely ended what we a lot of times refer to as the Bush 1 administration, and this came to pass at the hands of Ross Perot and Bill Clinton, who, of course, succeeded him as president. The ironic aspect of the 1992 election was that following the first Persian Gulf War, George H.W. Bush had the highest approval rating of any president ever at 89%. And just a short time later, a matter of around a year, his numbers were literally some of the lowest. So that's one interesting thing that you can always chalk up to American presidential politics, and that's that approval numbers are fleeting. Now, Bill Clinton was a very, very different type of manager than George H.W. Bush or Clinton's successor, George W. Bush. Whereas George H.W. Bush was kind of a very button-down collar, official, very structured guy. That's the way his administration was. People showed up to meetings on time. They all wore coats and ties. No one showed up late. And in the meetings, there was generally an understanding as to who was in charge. Clinton's administration, his meetings were completely different. People would show up. Maybe they wear a coat. Maybe they don't wear a tie. Maybe they walk in late. Some congressional leaders were allowed just to sit in. It was more like, one person described it as more of a coffee klatch. We would all sit around and, hey guys, let's think of how to make the world a better place. This is a far cry again from Bush 1 or Bush 2, who would succeed him. Now, you can take Bill Clinton's foreign policy and split it generally in half. The first 4 years, foreign policy wasn't really a priority. He focused on domestic renewal. Things largely continued in the same direction as under his predecessor, which was dealing with Europe and the concluding Soviet Union. That being said, there were some very important events that went on that occurred in his first 4 years. There was the first bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993. The Balkans, Bosnia, former Yugoslavia, erupted into a very, very bloody, very protracted civil and ethnic war. And of course, there was the failed NATO-sanctioned action in Somalia, chronicled in the book Black Hawk Down. There was in 1994, the following year, there was the genocide in Rwanda, which, because of NATO's inaction, nobody did anything about. Now, this is an important aspect of the Clinton administration and the Clinton foreign policy to understand. Bill Clinton is a textbook international relations liberal. Now, that's different from what we would understand as a domestic policy liberal. A foreign policy liberal believes in interconnectedness, large, high levels of trade, high levels of interaction, and through these things, we can develop peace. And international institutions are a large part of that. That is why you will see in every situation where the United States uses military force, it is sanctioned by the UN during the Clinton administration, and this was one example. Unfortunately, though, the UN, off the heels of their failure in Somalia, the UN Security Council declined to get involved in Rwanda and called it simply another civil war. Bill Clinton has gone on record as saying he still has large regrets about not getting involved in Rwanda and doing something. Again, these international institutions are a hallmark of the Clinton administration. This goes from the beginning of the World Trade Center World Trade Organization, in 1995, and then that same year in 1995, privately, the Clinton administration was already looking at plans to expand NATO, although they did not come out public with that. The second 4 years of the Clinton administration was a little more engaged, again, always under the auspice of an international organization. There were the bombings of the U.S. embassies in Africa. There was the bombing of the U.S. coal, which, of course, we really couldn't do that much about because we weren't really engaged in terror, because terror was not something that we were really, at this point, that adept at dealing with, especially when things happened in foreign countries. Again, in that second half of his administration, Clinton attempted to build and buttress international organizations. He signed the Kyoto Protocol for climate change, which was defeated by the Senate. NATO officially expanded, and he also signed off on America's entry into the International Criminal Court, which he did not send to the Senate for ratification. One thing that you can go ahead and associate with Bill Clinton, and that's globalization. When you think of Clinton, think of globalization and think international organizations. Again, this is noted by the liberal logic of interconnectedness, the expansion of international organizations, and the idea that when we get together and talk in organizations like the World Trade Organization, NATO, in Europe's case, the EU and the UN, we can avert war. On that, Clinton said, globalization is something that we can't turn off. It is the economic equivalent of a force of nature like wind or water. The Clinton tenure is a good example of how we can take stock in the post-Cold War world. We see a lot of problems that the presidents after the Cold War will consistently have to deal with. We're finally seeing in his administration, what is the world going to look like? This new multipolar world. First, we have to take account of historical antecedents. That's a really neat way of saying, a lot of people who didn't get along before World War I, well, as soon as the Cold War was over, they got right back to not liking one another. World War I imposed borders and governments on many people in Central and Eastern Europe. World War II tore the region apart. The Cold War, with communist oppression, managed to keep those ancient animosities in check. And as soon as that bipolar structure that we had talked about last week kind of fell by the wayside, all bets were off, and that's when we started seeing wars break out. A classic example, of course, is Yugoslavia. And you think back, remember, this is the country that brought us World War I. It was the animosities there that started us into the warring period of Western civilization. In that respect, very little happened when Tito, the communist leader, died and communism fell. Wars broke out over a series of about 20 years. The same can be said about many other dynamics in Europe, even still today. You'll hear the Poles and the Hungarians, they have an issue with German leadership. Again, that's historical. There are large fears amongst the former Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as well as the Ukraine, justifiably so, of Russian aggression. Poland, who, of course, they were the corridor for every invasion for about a couple hundred years. Poland's gone so far as to say they want an American base in Poland and are willing to pay for it. Of course, that's not something the EU likes. But anyway, remember, historical antecedents. If you want to find out what politics in Europe is like right now, it's far closer to the way things were between 1910 and 1920 than they were between 1970 and 1980. Because with the bipolar structure gone in a multipolar world, these countries are kind of left to their own devices. Nuclear proliferation remains a concern of the United States today. Of course, that started when the Soviet Union fell, and we needed to safeguard their arsenal, which large parts of it were not in what we call Russia today. They were in the satellite states and the other Soviet republics. However, especially during the time of Clinton, this was an issue. Both France and China conducted nuclear tests. There were nuclear tests by Pakistan and India. They joined the nuclear group. North Korea, of course, gained a arsenal of their own. Israel, we think, has nuclear weapons. Iraq, we think or thought had weapons of mass destruction. And Iran, of course, is pursuing a nuclear arsenal. These aspects, of course, specifically aimed at Iran and North Korea, are the beginning of what became known as Rogue Doctrine. Now, this started in 1991 after the first Gulf War and remained moderately relevant until 9/11. And what this basically says is the large concerns for nuclear war in this world do not come from the Soviets, they don't come from the Americans, and they don't come from Europeans. They come from these small rogue states that seek to gain advantage and leverage by using nuclear threat. Think of North Korea in today's modern context. Radical Islamic terror went largely unchecked up until 9/11. This would be the dominant foreign policy of our next occupant of the White House, George W. Bush. Now, there is a very large body of alternative history that asks and attempts to answer the question, what would the George W. Bush administration have been like without 9/11? Zbigniew Brzezinski discusses what was the George W. Bush legacy by calling it talking about how America's standing suffered, how Iraq was a geopolitical disaster, and how the attack on Iraq has increased the terror threat to the United States. Much of what we knew, or he knew when he published his book, has been disproven. They did find WMDs in Iraq. But there are a few things, however, that we can learn from the George W. Bush administration. First, regime change can be bad business. You don't go to war and try to end the government without having a clear picture of what's going to happen after that government's gone. We saw that in Iraq. Nation building is a failed strategy. It doesn't matter how many libraries and schools we build for people. That's the infrastructure side. They have to have institutions in place, and you really can't force those, and you can't force your institutions on somebody. The failing of this strategy caused many in the Bush 2 administration to leave, foremost of them Francis Fukuyama, who is a leading analyst. Democracy versus self-determination. We thought that if we could go in and have elections, that eventually they would have countries just like ours. And of course, that didn't happen. We saw that not only in Iraq, but more recently in Egypt, where they voted the Muslim Brotherhood into power, who do not advocate democracy as we know it. And finally, the pitfalls of unilateral action. It's very expensive politically. It costs in what they call blood and treasure. And it's not something that's advisable. If there are any questions about this period in U.S. foreign policy or anything else, feel free to contact me